At the beginning of his work, Carl Jung described something that most people only begin to understand much later in life, which is that what we fail to face within ourselves does not simply disappear or dissolve over time, but instead continues to live within us in more subtle and often unconscious ways, shaping how we feel, how we react, and how we experience the world without us ever fully realizing where it all comes from. And nowhere is this more visible, and at the same time more hidden, than in the part of you that never truly grew up. Because despite everything you have become, despite the years that have passed, the responsibilities you have taken on, the identity you have built, and the way you have learned to move through life with a certain level of control, awareness, and independence, there is still a part of you that exists beneath all of that, a part of you that has not moved on in the same way, a part of you that still feels what it once felt, that still holds what it once experienced, and that still responds as if certain moments never fully ended. And the unsettling truth is that you carry this part of you into every situation, every interaction, and every emotional experience, not as something you consciously think about, but as something that quietly influences you from the background, shaping your reactions in ways that can sometimes feel confusing, overwhelming, or even out of proportion. Because there are moments in your life where something small happens, something seemingly insignificant, something that your rational mind immediately recognizes as minor or unimportant. And yet, at the same time, something inside of you reacts as if it is anything but small. A message that is not answered. A subtle shift in someone's tone. A moment of distance that you cannot fully explain. And suddenly, without warning, your emotional state changes in a way that feels immediate, intense, and difficult to control, as if something much deeper has been touched, even though the situation itself does not fully justify what you are feeling. And in those moments, you may find yourself trying to understand it, trying to calm yourself down, trying to bring logic into something that does not seem to respond to logic at all, telling yourself that you are overreacting, that you should not feel this way, that it does not make sense. And yet the feeling remains, persistent, undeniable, and often overwhelming. But what if the problem is not that you are overreacting, but that you are remembering? Not remembering in the way you usually think of memory, not through clear images or specific thoughts, but through your body, through your emotional system, through patterns that were formed long before you had the ability to understand or process what was happening to you. Because as a child, you did not experience the world with distance or perspective. You experienced it directly, emotionally, and completely, without the ability to step back and say that something was not about you, or that someone else's behavior came from their own limitations rather than your worth. All you could do was feel. And those feelings did not simply pass through you and disappear. They shaped you. They settled into you. They became part of how you see yourself, how you relate to others, and what you expect from the world around you. And over time, in order to adapt, in order to stay connected, in order to feel safe in an environment that was not always consistent, predictable, or emotionally attuned to your needs, you learn to adjust yourself in ways that made sense at the time, but that may no longer serve you now. You learned when to speak and when to stay silent. You learned what parts of yourself were acceptable and what parts were not. You learned how to respond in ways that would reduce the risk of rejection, disconnection, or emotional pain. But in doing so, you left something behind. Not because you wanted to, not because you chose to, but because at that moment it felt necessary. A part of you that did not get to express what it truly felt. A part of you that did not get the response it needed. A part of you that had to carry something alone, without the understanding, guidance, or presence that could have helped it move through it. And that part of you did not disappear. It remained exactly where it was, holding the same emotional charge, waiting in the same state, responding in the same way whenever something in your present life feels similar enough to bring it back to the surface. And this is why, even now, you can feel something inside of you that does not seem to match who you are today. Something that feels younger, more vulnerable, more reactive, and at times even out of place. Because part of you is still living in a moment that has not fully been processed or resolved. And until you begin to turn toward that part of yourself, not with judgment, not with resistance, but with curiosity, presence, and a willingness to understand, it will continue to speak in the only way it knows how. Through your emotions, through your reactions, through the patterns that keep repeating, even when you consciously want something different. As a child, you did not have the ability to step outside of your experiences and observe them with distance, clarity, or understanding, because everything that happened around you was not something you could analyze or question, but something you had to absorb, interpret, and adapt to in real time, often without guidance, without explanation, and without the emotional support that would have allowed you to process it in a healthy and complete way. And because of that, everything felt deeply personal. Not because it actually was, but because you had no other framework through which to understand it. So when someone withdrew from you, even in subtle ways, even in moments that may have seemed insignificant from the outside, it did not register as that person being distracted, overwhelmed, or emotionally unavailable, but as something within you that caused that distance, something about you that was not enough to keep them close. And when your emotions were not met, when they were dismissed, ignored, misunderstood, or even criticized, it did not feel like a limitation in the other person's ability to respond, but like a reflection of something being wrong with what you felt, as if your inner experience itself was too much, too inconvenient, or too difficult to handle. And when love, attention, or validation came in inconsistent ways, sometimes present and sometimes absent, sometimes warm and sometimes distant, you did not see that as unpredictability in your environment, but as instability in your own worth, as something that could be gained or lost depending on how you behaved, how you adapted, and how well you aligned yourself with what was expected of you. And slowly, without you ever consciously deciding it, without you even being aware that it was happening, you began to form conclusions about yourself that were not based on truth, but on survival. Not logical conclusions, not clearly defined thoughts that you could easily recall or question, but deep emotional beliefs that settled into your system and started shaping how you saw yourself, how you related to others, and how you moved through the world. Beliefs like the quiet sense that you had to adjust yourself in order to be accepted, that your natural way of feeling or expressing might not be welcome, that showing too much of who you are could lead to disconnection rather than closeness, and that safety in relationships depended on your ability to adapt rather than simply exist. And once those beliefs took hold, you began to change. Not in one clear moment, not in a way that you could point to and say, this is where everything shifted, but gradually, subtly, through repeated experiences that reinforced the same underlying message. You learned to become more aware of others than of yourself, constantly scanning for signals, for changes in tone, in mood, in energy, trying to anticipate what was needed so that you could respond in a way that would maintain connection and reduce the risk of rejection. Or you learned to become more independent, relying on yourself because depending on others did not always feel safe or reliable, telling yourself that you did not need much, that you could handle things alone, that your needs were not that important. Or perhaps you learned to become more expressive, more reactive, more intense, because that was the only way to be seen at all, the only way to break through the distance and make your presence known in an environment where subtlety went unnoticed. But no matter how it showed up, it all came from the same place. A child trying to stay connected. A child trying to feel safe. A child trying to be loved in a way that felt consistent and secure. And in that process, you began to move away from yourself. Not because you wanted to, not because there was something wrong with you, but because it felt necessary in order to maintain the relationships that you depended on. Because at some point, consciously or unconsciously, you learned that being fully yourself did not guarantee connection, and that losing connection was something you could not afford. So you started to silence certain emotions before they could be expressed. You started to hide certain needs before they could be rejected. You started to disconnect from parts of yourself that did not seem to fit within the environment you were in. And over time, this became automatic. It became your way of being, your way of relating, your way of protecting yourself without even realizing that protection was still needed. But the parts of you that you left behind in that process did not disappear. They remained exactly where they were, holding the same emotions, the same unmet needs, the same longing to be seen, understood, and responded to in a way that never fully happened. And this is why, even now, there can be moments where something inside of you feels younger than you are, more vulnerable than you expect, more reactive than you would like, as if a part of you is still living in a time where those needs were not yet met. Because in many ways, it is. And until that part of you is finally met in a different way, until it is given the attention, the presence, and the response that was once missing, it will continue to wait, to react, and to reach out in the only way it knows how. There are moments in your life where something happens that, on the surface, seems so small, so ordinary, so easy to dismiss, that you almost feel confused by your own reaction. Because while your mind quickly recognizes that nothing truly significant has occurred, your body and your emotions begin to respond as if something much deeper has just been touched. And this is where the internal conflict begins. Because one part of you is trying to stay grounded in the present, trying to make sense of the situation, trying to reassure yourself that everything is fine, that you are safe, that there is no real reason to feel the way you do. while another part of you is already overwhelmed, already activated, already reacting in a way that feels immediate, intense, and difficult to control. And the more you try to suppress that reaction, the more confusing it becomes. Because it does not respond to logic. It does not calm down just because you tell yourself that it should. It does not disappear simply because you decide that it is not justified. And this is the moment where many people begin to turn against themselves. They start to judge what they feel. They start to label themselves as too sensitive, too emotional, too reactive. They start to believe that there is something wrong with them, something that needs to be fixed, controlled, or pushed away. But what if the reaction itself is not the problem? What if it is the signal? Because your nervous system does not react to situations based on their objective importance. It reacts based on what feels familiar, based on patterns that have been stored over time, based on emotional experiences that have not yet been fully processed or resolved. It is constantly scanning your environment, not for what is new, but for what resembles something it has felt before, something that once carried emotional weight, something that once required you to adapt in order to stay safe, connected, or accepted. And the moment it recognizes even the slightest similarity, it responds. Not carefully, not gradually, but immediately and instinctively, as if the past is unfolding again in the present moment. And this is why a delayed message can feel like rejection, even when there is no clear intention behind it, because somewhere in your past, silence may have meant disconnection, distance, or emotional absence. This is why a small moment of criticism can feel overwhelming, even when it is mild or constructive, because at some point, being corrected or judged may have been tied to deeper feelings of not being good enough. This is why a subtle shift in someone's energy can create a sense of unease, tension, or anxiety, even when nothing explicit has been said, because you have learned, often unconsciously, to read between the lines, to anticipate change, to detect potential disconnection before it fully happens. And none of this takes place in your thoughts first. It happens in your body, in the tightening of your chest, in the heaviness in your stomach, in the sudden rush of emotion that seems to come out of nowhere. And because you cannot always trace it back to a clear memory, because there is no obvious explanation that fits the intensity of what you are feeling, you begin to question yourself instead of the origin of the reaction. You tell yourself that you should be able to handle this, that you are overreacting, that you need to calm down. But what if, instead of something to suppress, this is something to understand? Because every trigger carries information, not about what is wrong with you, but about what has not yet been fully seen, fully felt, or fully processed within you. It is your system's way of bringing your attention to something that is still active beneath the surface, something that has been waiting, often quietly, for the opportunity to be acknowledged in a different way. And when you begin to shift your perspective in that direction, when you stop seeing your reactions as problems and start seeing them as messages, something begins to change. Because instead of fighting what you feel, you begin to listen to it. Instead of pushing it away, you begin to turn toward it. Instead of judging yourself, you begin to become curious. And that shift, small as it may seem in the moment, is the beginning of something much deeper. Because your inner child does not speak through logic, explanation, or clear reasoning. It speaks through emotion, through sensation, through patterns that repeat until they are finally understood. And every time something within you reacts more strongly than you expect, more quickly than you can control, or more deeply than the situation seems to justify, it is not random. It is reaching out. The question is not whether it is there. The question is, are you willing to respond to it differently than you have before? Understanding where your patterns come from, recognizing how your past continues to shape your present, and becoming aware of the deeper meaning behind your emotional reactions can create a powerful shift in how you see yourself. But insight alone is rarely enough to change what is still being held on a deeper, more emotional level. Because the part of you that is still carrying these experiences does not need explanation. It does not need you to analyze it, to understand it intellectually, or to find the perfect words to describe it. It needs something much simpler, and at the same time, much more difficult. It needs to be met. Not in the way you have learned to meet yourself until now, not through control, not through judgment, not through the constant attempt to fix or change what you feel, but through presence, through attention, and through a willingness to stay with something that you may have spent years trying to move away from. And for many people, this is where the real challenge begins. Because turning toward yourself in this way can feel unfamiliar, uncomfortable, and even slightly unsettling, especially if you have built your way of coping around staying busy, staying in control, or staying focused on everything outside of you. But if you allow yourself, just for a moment, to slow down, to step out of the constant movement of your thoughts, to create a small space between what you feel and how you usually respond to it, something begins to open. So instead of trying to do this perfectly, instead of trying to get it right, simply begin by bringing your attention inward, noticing your body, noticing your breathing, noticing whatever sensation is present without immediately trying to change it, fix it, or move away from it. And as you do this, you may start to notice that beneath the surface of your thoughts, beneath the stories you tell yourself, there is something more subtle, something quieter, something that is not expressed in words but in feeling. And instead of pushing it away, stay with it. Allow it to be there, exactly as it is, without needing it to be different. And now, gently, without forcing anything, without trying too hard, begin to imagine that this feeling you are noticing does not just belong to the present moment, but to a younger version of you, a version of you that once felt something very similar, perhaps in a different situation, perhaps in a different context, but with the same emotional tone. And rather than thinking about it, allow yourself to sense it. A younger you, not as an abstract idea, but as a presence. Maybe you can see them clearly. Maybe you can only feel that they are there. Maybe you notice a certain emotion, a posture, an energy, and instead of analyzing what you see or feel, simply stay, because this is the part that has been waiting, not for solutions, not for explanations, but for attention. And if you allow yourself to remain present, without rushing, without needing to change anything, you may begin to notice something subtle in that connection, something that shifts the moment you stop turning away. Because where there was once distance, there is now contact. Where there was once silence, there is now awareness. And from that place, something new becomes possible. Not something forced, not something scripted, but something that emerges naturally when you allow yourself to respond differently than you have before. You can begin to acknowledge what is there. Not in a perfect way, not in a rehearsed way, but in a way that feels real. You can recognize what this part of you is carrying. You can feel what it has been holding. You can begin to sense what it may have needed, but never fully received. And without trying to fix everything at once, without trying to undo the past, you can simply begin by being there. Because that, in itself, is already different. And slowly, as you continue to stay, as you continue to bring your attention back instead of turning away, you begin to create a new kind of relationship with yourself, one that is not based on avoidance, control, or suppression, but on presence. And that is where something begins to shift. Not dramatically, not all at once, but in a way that builds over time. Because every moment you choose to turn toward what you once had to leave behind, you are changing something at the deepest level of your experience, not by forcing yourself to feel differently, but by finally allowing yourself to feel at all. For a long time, without fully realizing it, the relationship you have developed with yourself has been shaped not only by what you experienced, but by how you learned to respond to those experiences. Because in moments where your emotions were not fully understood, you gradually learned to move away from them. And in moments where your needs were not consistently met, you slowly began to ignore them, not out of choice, but out of adaptation. And over time, this way of relating to yourself became so familiar, so automatic, that it started to feel like who you are, rather than something you learned. Because when you felt something intense, something uncomfortable, something that required attention, your first instinct was not to stay with it, but to manage it, to control it, to reduce it, or to push it away in order to keep functioning, in order to stay stable, in order to avoid feeling overwhelmed in a way that once felt unmanageable. And from the outside, this can look like strength. It can look like independence, like resilience, like the ability to keep going no matter what you feel, no matter what you carry, no matter what is happening beneath the surface. But on the inside, there is often something else. A subtle disconnection. A quiet sense that something within you is not fully being heard, not fully being acknowledged, not fully being responded to in the way it needs. Because the part of you that once needed presence learned to expect absence. And the part of you that once needed understanding learned to expect silence. And without noticing it, you became the one who continued that pattern. You became the one who dismisses what you feel before it fully unfolds. You became the one who tells yourself to move on before something has been processed. You became the one who expects yourself to be okay, even when something inside of you is not. And this is where something important begins to shift. Because healing is not only about feeling what was once unfelt, but about changing the way you respond to yourself in the moments where those feelings arise again. And every time something is triggered within you, Every time an emotion surfaces that feels familiar, intense, or difficult to hold, you are faced with a choice that you may not have been aware of before. A choice between continuing the same pattern or creating something new. Because you can respond in the way you always have, by moving away from what you feel, by distracting yourself, by minimizing it, by telling yourself that it does not matter. Or you can pause, even if only for a brief moment, and allow yourself to recognize what is happening inside of you without immediately trying to change it. And in that pause, something subtle but deeply significant begins to take place. Because instead of reinforcing the pattern of disconnection, you begin to introduce a different experience. An experience where your feelings are not immediately dismissed. An experience where your inner world is not something you have to hide from yourself. An experience where what you feel is allowed to exist, even if it is uncomfortable, even if it is unclear, even if it does not make sense right away. And this is how trust is rebuilt. Not through one single moment, not through one realization, and not through one attempt to respond differently, but through repeated experiences where you show yourself, again and again, that you are willing to stay, that you are willing to listen, that you are willing to respond with patience instead of pressure, with awareness instead of avoidance, with presence instead of control. Because trust is not something you can convince yourself of through words. It is something that is built through experience. And for the part of you that once felt alone, that once felt unseen, that once felt like it had to carry everything by itself, this changes everything. Because where there was once unpredictability, there is now consistency. Where there was once absence, there is now presence. Where there was once disconnection, there is now a growing sense of being held from within. And slowly, without force, without pressure, without needing to rush the process, that part of you begins to respond. Not by disappearing, not by shutting down, but by softening, by becoming less reactive, less overwhelmed, less alone in what it carries, not because it has been pushed to change, but because it no longer has to fight to be seen. And this is where something deeper begins to emerge. Not just a change in how you feel, but a change in how you relate to yourself. Because instead of being someone who abandons what you feel, you begin to become someone who stays, someone who listens, someone who allows, someone who no longer turns away from their own experience, even when it is difficult. And that shift is the beginning of something real. There comes a moment, not loud, not dramatic, but deeply real, where you begin to notice that something inside of you is no longer reacting the way it used to. Not because life has changed, but because you have. Where you once moved away from what you felt, you now begin to stay. Where you once judged yourself, you now begin to understand. And where you once felt overwhelmed without knowing why, you now begin to see that nothing inside of you was ever random. That it all had a reason, that it all made sense, that it was all trying to show you something. And slowly, you stop fighting yourself. You stop trying to fix what you feel. And you begin to listen to it instead. And in that shift, something powerful happens. Because the part of you that once felt unseen is now being met. The part of you that once felt alone is no longer alone. And the part of you that once had to carry everything by itself finally doesn't have to anymore. And that is where real change begins. Not in becoming someone new, but in becoming someone who no longer leaves themselves behind. And if something in this video spoke to you, if you recognized a part of yourself in these words, make sure to subscribe. Because this kind of work doesn't happen in one moment. It happens over time. And if you're ready to go deeper, I'll see you in the next video.